What if one of the most terrifying figures in modern horror cinema wasn't fiction, but rooted in reality, carefully buried beneath layers of cinematic fantasy? In this gripping video, we unravel the disturbing truth behind the Demon Nun, a horror icon introduced in the Conjuring universe. Was Valak merely a creative invention, or was there something or someone far more sinister haunting the shadows of the Warren archives? Dive into a tale that Hollywood only hinted at, and prepare to question what's real. In the quiet corners of their Monroe home, where the walls whispered secrets and time seemed to bend, Lorraine Warren sat cross-legged on the floor of their modest library. Ed's old leather-bound journal lay open in front of her. The ink had faded, but the fear embedded in those pages remained alive, undeniable and pulsing. It was an entry she hadn't revisited in decades, one tied to a case they never dared to disclose. Not fully, not even to their closest collaborators. The words bled dread. She wasn't human, cloaked in a habit, but her eyes were empty mirrors. It began with a letter in the spring of 1954. A priest from Romania had contacted the Warrens through a mutual acquaintance at the Vatican. His tone was desperate, nearly broken. A monastery nestled deep in the Carpathian Mountains had experienced what he called a spiritual fracture. The nuns had reported voices echoing through the halls in dead Latin, walls that wept blood, and the sighting of a tall, veiled figure that never seemed to walk, only appear. Ed, skeptical yet intrigued, agreed to go. Lorraine, after a vision that left her trembling and speechless, insisted on accompanying him. Her instincts, those delicate threads connecting her to the other side, screamed warnings, but they went. The journey was long and harrowing. As they approached the monastery, the sky darkened unnaturally, even though it was mid-afternoon. The structure loomed ahead, more fortress than sanctuary. Its stones were ancient, blackened by time and what Lorraine would later call something older than sin. From the moment they stepped inside, Lorraine was gripped by visions, not fleeting glimpses, but violent, immersive episodes. She saw herself walking the narrow stone corridors, but in every reflection, she was followed by a tall nun in black, face hidden, presence overwhelming. Ed tried to dismiss them at first as stress-induced hallucinations, but then he saw her too. Late one night, Ed was walking alone to the chapel when he heard the distinct sound of chanting, guttural, rhythmic, and in no known dialect. As he followed the sound, the corridor grew colder, the walls closer. Then, he saw her, a figure standing motionless at the far end of the hallway, her face obscured, yet her presence unmistakable. As he blinked, she vanished. The monks and nuns refused to speak her name. When pressed, they simply crossed themselves and muttered, "Ia ker nu trebuie numită," she who must not be named. But one monk broke the silence. He claimed the entity had arrived centuries ago, born of a sacrilegious act committed during the monastery's construction. The place was never cleansed. It was built on cursed ground. Ed and Lorraine documented everything. But as the days passed, it became clear that their usual tools, the crucifix, the holy water, the prayers, had no effect. The figure was not a spirit, it was something else. Something pretending to be holy, to mock the sacred. In her most harrowing vision, Lorraine was pulled into what she described as a mirror world. The monastery decayed before her eyes. The walls bled, the nuns screamed, and at the center stood the Demon Nun, face still hidden, whispering in tongues no living soul should hear. When she woke, she had claw marks down her arms and Latin, phrases etched in bruises on her skin. They left Romania under the insistence of the local clergy. Their presence, they were told, was aggravating the entity. But the Demon Nun had followed them into dreams, shadows, and eventually the walls of their own museum. The fog was thick, almost sentient, clinging to the Warrens' rented vehicle as they ascended the narrow road toward the monastery. Locals had already refused to accompany them any further. "That place," one driver muttered, "swallows the light." Ed tried to reassure Lorraine, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. He hadn't seen her this disturbed since Amityville, and that case had nearly broken them both. The monastery appeared like a scar on the mountain, a towering relic that seemed to push back against the sky. Its gates creaked open as if unwillingly, and a silence engulfed them so total it throbbed in their ears. The head nun, Mother Agnes, greeted them with wary eyes. She was in her 70s, yet moved with urgency. "You must never separate," she warned. "She hunts the alone." The rooms were cold and dimly lit, the air perpetually tinged with incense and something metallic, like blood. Lorraine's visions intensified. She saw a young nun leaping from the tower with her rosary still clutched in her hand. She saw shadows that stretched against the laws of light, and worst of all, she felt the nun's breath against her neck, chilling and deliberate. That night, they heard the knocking. 3 raps on the chapel door, no one there. Then 3 more on the walls outside their room. The pattern, 3 knocks, was a known mockery of the Holy Trinity, often used in demonic manifestations. Ed and Lorraine exchanged glances. They had seen this before, but never this strong. Mother Agnes finally confided that the entity had appeared decades earlier, after an excavation revealed a hidden chamber beneath the monastery. Inside had been ancient texts, grotesque relics, and a sealed sarcophagus wrapped in chains of blackened iron. A ritual had been performed to reseal it, but something had awakened. Lorraine asked to see the chamber. What she experienced inside was never fully recorded. Ed wrote only that Lorraine screamed a name that shook the bones of the room. She collapsed, unconscious for hours. When she awoke, she was different, quieter. She didn't speak of what she saw. Not then. Before they departed, Ed placed a crucifix at the altar and blessed it in the old rites. It shattered the next morning. That was their sign to leave. But as the gates of the monastery closed behind them, Lorraine whispered, "She's not done." To this day, the tapes from Romania remain locked in a sealed vault, recordings too dangerous to release, and visions too dark to relive. As the days passed after their return from Romania, Ed and Lorraine Warren attempted to resume their normal routine, if one could ever call the life they led normal. But something had followed them, not in body perhaps, but in essence. Lorraine could feel it, coiling in the shadows of their home like smoke trapped in glass. A presence that watched, listened, and waited. One evening, while cataloging artifacts for the occult museum, Lorraine stopped cold. A crucifix she had blessed weeks before lay on the floor, snapped clean in half. Nearby, a framed photo of the Romanian monastery had cracked along its center, the break running straight through the image of the chapel door. She knew. She didn't need visions or voices this time. The Demon Nun had found a way back, determined. To understand what they had encountered, Ed dove into ancient demonology texts and obscure religious manuscripts. Lorraine, hesitant but resolute, revisited her trance state abilities under tightly controlled conditions. The name she had uttered in Romania, one she could not recall, began to resurface in fragmented dreams. Always whispered, always incomplete. Then came the breakthrough. In a 17th century manuscript tucked away in the Vatican's restricted archives, accessed through one of Ed's discreet contacts, they found a name, Valak, described as the Defiler, the Marquis of Snakes. Valak was no ordinary demon. Though commonly depicted in medieval texts as a child with angelic wings riding a 2-headed dragon, several references made note of his affinity for disguises. "He wears what is most holy to mock the divine," one entry read. "He walks cloaked, as what you trust, a nun, a disguise chosen not just for blasphemy, but for infiltration. By appearing in the form of one of the most sacred and selfless human vessels, Valak had access to sanctified ground, prayer rituals, and the faith of the innocent." Lorraine, reading the accounts aloud, nearly wept. The pieces aligned. It wasn't a haunting, it was possession masquerading as purity. Lorraine recalled a night in Romania when she had looked into the monastery mirror and seen not her reflection, but a veiled figure mimicking her every movement. She hadn't understood the message then. Now she did. Valak had seen her, touched her, and marked her. In the days that followed, the Warrens received letters from others who had visited the monastery, priests and investigators, each describing similar visions. A faceless nun, a voice speaking in ancient Akkadian, unexplained. Injuries, crucifixes turning upside down in their hands. One priest disappeared altogether. Another took his own life. But one letter stood out. It was from Sister Helena, the last surviving nun from the Romanian cloister. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blurred in places where tears, or something worse, had stained the paper. Her final words chilled Lorraine to the bone. She knows your name now. She is learning your soul. Lorraine's dreams intensified. In one, she walked the endless corridors of the monastery again, only this time it was flooded in blood. The walls bled prayers, and every door she opened revealed versions of herself, lifeless, violated, crucified. And always at the end of the hallway, the nun waited. This wasn't over. They had escaped Romania, but they had not escaped her. For all their public visibility, Ed and Lorraine Warren kept detailed private archives, locked rooms, encrypted tapes, and notebooks never shared beyond their most trusted circle. It was in one such vault that they stored the Romania case under the codename Vestalis Nocturna, Night's Nun. The decision to keep it secret wasn't taken lightly, but Lorraine feared the power of knowledge, how even naming this entity could draw its attention. Still, after the death of Sister Helena, they realized silence was no longer an option. They reached out to two of their oldest collaborators, Father James Brennan, a seasoned exorcist trained by the Vatican, and Dr. Elise Tannenbaum, a psychologist, who specialized in cases of shared hallucinations and religious delusion. Both were presented with the Romania files. Brennan wept. Elise remained skeptical. The group convened in a remote cabin in the Berkshires, far from population centers and insulated by nature. There, they conducted controlled readings of Lorraine's trance transcripts. The room grew colder. The fire dimmed. Ed noted that the shadow in the corner of the room did not shift with the light. During one session, Lorraine slipped into a sudden trance. Her voice dropped in pitch, speaking fluent Latin, though she had never studied the language deeply. The phrase repeated again and again, Domina tenebris adest. The Lady of Darkness is here. When she awoke, Lorraine was disoriented and covered in scratches. Not self-inflicted. The wounds were on her back. At Brennan's urging, Ed sent a sealed copy of their findings to a former Vatican official known only as Monsignor Alaric. His reply was cryptic but definitive. The name you uncovered must never be spoken aloud. It is not myth. It is interdicted. Cease all inquiry. But Ed could not. In his determination, he reached out to Tony Spera, his son-in-law and museum curator, to begin investigating physical evidence left behind from Romania, particularly a strand of rosary beads they had recovered from the monastery chapel. When placed inside a sacred circle, the beads began to vibrate. Tony filmed the event. In the recording, a soft whisper is barely audible. "You brought me home." They had, in trying to contain her, created a channel. This is why Ed ultimately locked the case away. He feared what Lorraine already knew, that Valak was not bound by place, nor by prayer. She had crossed over through faith itself. By believing in her, they gave her form, and the most terrifying truth? She wasn't finished. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, sealed not with wax, but with a pressed imprint of the papal insignia, faint and worn, as though its sender feared even divine authority could not contain what it bore. Ed received it on a rainy October morning. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Father Matteo Benedetti, a Jesuit scholar once considered for sainthood, until he vanished in 1968 under mysterious circumstances. The letter was dated just days before his disappearance. Inside, the contents were sparse but staggering. A single sheet, handwritten, translated from Latin. "You have touched that which should not be touched. She is not of this world, nor bound by its laws. Valak is no demon in disguise. She is the gate." Ed read the line over and over. She is the gate. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a revelation. Valak, the demon cloaked as a nun, wasn't just a tormentor. She was a conduit, an opening between realms. Where she stood, the walls between this world and the infernal thinned to near nothingness. The letter detailed a failed rite performed in the 1500s beneath Vatican ground, where the entity had first been encountered during the Inquisition. The rite was meant to contain her essence within relics buried beneath ancient churches. But one relic, one mistake, had been stolen and eventually traveled through hands, finding its final resting place in the monastery Ed and Lorraine visited. Lorraine, upon hearing this, was overcome with nausea. She remembered her vision from the trance, 1,000 hands reaching through cracks in a bleeding wall, clawing at her, screaming without sound. They hadn't just encountered Valak in Romania, they had stood upon the threshold of something far worse. The Vatican letter included coordinates leading to an abandoned archive beneath a ruined abbey in Siena, Italy. Ed and Lorraine hesitated, but their calling was clear. Accompanied by Father Brennan, they traveled in secrecy. Beneath the abbey's crumbling facade, hidden behind a false wall, they found it. A black manuscript bound in flayed leather, marked with blood seals. It was the Codex Nocturnus, a forbidden tome, older than most languages, cataloging the 72 known gates between the worlds. Valak was not only listed, but circled, with annotations from centuries of frightened priests. She was identified as the primary conduit, and one terrifying line, added recently in English, confirmed their greatest fear. The gate is weakening. When they returned to the US, Lorraine refused to sleep alone. The house groaned differently, shadows lingered longer, and at night, beneath the ticking of Ed's office clock, they both began to hear it. 3 knocks, always 3. To the US public, the Warren Occult Museum was a curiosity, a place where haunted dolls and possessed relics sat behind glass, safely contained. But Ed and Lorraine knew better. They understood that containment was a constant, living ritual. Each object demanded vigilance, prayer, respect, which is why what happened one autumn afternoon was so chilling. Tony Sparrow was overseeing routine, blessings in the museum, accompanied by a local priest and a college student volunteering to document the process. One display stood out, an old, weather-worn veil said to be retrieved from Romania. It was rumored to have belonged to a nun who vanished in 1832 after reporting dreams of a faceless sister following her. The student, skeptical and emboldened by youth, laughed. "Is this what Hollywood turned into Valak?" he asked aloud mockingly. Then, in front of the priest, he reached out and touched the glass. The lights flickered. The priest immediately began the binding prayer again, louder this time. But the air grew thick, suffocating. The student stepped back, coughing uncontrollably, and then he screamed, not from pain, but terror. "She's in my head," he shouted. "She's in me." Tony rushed to him. The boy's eyes were wide, staring past reality. He collapsed. When they revived him, he was different, quiet, eyes sunken. He would never return to the museum again. Ed and Lorraine arrived hours later. They checked the security footage. At the exact moment the student touched the glass, the veil inside moved, subtly but undeniably. Lorraine turned to Ed and said, "She's testing the walls." From that day forward, that section of the museum was sealed off, and the veil, surrounded by multiple layers of sacred symbols, relics, and salt lines. Still, Lorraine insisted on daily blessings, and even then, it wasn't enough. Over the next weeks, visitors to the museum began reporting strange occurrences. Whispers in rooms no one was in, feelings of being watched, the sudden smell of incense where none had been burned. Tony began sleeping in shifts, guarding the museum at night with a Bible on his chest. Then came the worst. One morning, Tony found the veil outside its case, laid neatly on the floor in the shape of a cross. Lorraine sat down with Father Brennan the next day. "It's not just a memory anymore," she said. "She's becoming." And that night, for the first time since Romania, Lorraine dreamed of the monastery again. Only this time, the demon nun turned her face toward her. There was no skin, only eyes. It had been months since the veil incident at the Warren Occult Museum, and while no new attacks had occurred, There was a silence Lorraine found more terrifying than any scream. It was the kind of calm that didn't offer peace, but the warning of a storm yet to arrive. She had seen this pattern before. Evil didn't always scream. It watched, it studied, and then it struck. The signs were subtle at first. Lorraine began waking at 3:07 a.m. each morning, gasping for breath, always with the same phrase on her lips. "It's open." She couldn't remember the dreams, only the feeling of falling, endlessly, into blackness so complete it crushed thought. One morning, she walked into the kitchen to find every drawer and cabinet open, the knives standing vertically in the table as if someone, or something, had carefully arranged them into a ritualistic shape. Ed tried to console her, blaming it on a Sleepwalkers episode, but they both knew better. The house had been sealed. No one entered or left. More troubling were the messages on the mirrors. Condensation would form strange words during her showers, Latin phrases, old prayers, and once a chilling sentence in English. "You saw her. She never left." It was clear. The presence from Romania had not only returned, it had never fully gone. Lorraine was still connected to it, tied by the visions and the psychic scars left from that monastery. But now something had changed. Valak no longer needed shadows or dreams to manifest. She was gaining ground. One night, while attending a Mahdi spiritual symposium in Philadelphia, Lorraine collapsed mid-speech. When she awoke, she began speaking in a voice not her own. Recordings from the event captured her uttering a phrase no one present could translate. But Ed, after intense research, traced it back to an archaic Mesopotamian dialect, one associated with gates to the underworld. It confirmed their greatest fear. Valak was not acting alone. She was a herald. In a desperate effort, Lorraine underwent an intensive spiritual cleansing conducted by 5 ordained clergy members from different denominations. The process was grueling. Lorraine screamed, vomited black bile, and convulsed for over an hour. At the height of the ritual, every light in the room blew out simultaneously. When it was over, the room was drenched in silence, and Lorraine opened her eyes, whispering, "She's still here." Ed and Lorraine knew then that banishment wouldn't be enough. They had to return to the source, to the monastery. There, something had been left undone. A thread remained open, and it was unraveling fast, but that night she dreamed of a million eyes in the dark. When James Wan's The Conjuring 2 introduced the world to the Demon Nun, audiences were captivated by her chilling presence. But few knew that behind the camera there was a different kind of fear brewing, one not orchestrated by actors or special effects. Lorraine had been invited as a consultant on the film. She watched closely as the crew designed the creature, noting with discomfort how similar the appearance was to her own visions she had never shared publicly. When she asked Juan where he drew inspiration for the nun's design, his answer left her shaken. "It came to me in a dream. I saw her standing at the edge of my bed." The dreams weren't isolated. Several crew members reported nightmares involving a veiled figure. One assistant director left the set after claiming the crucifix around her neck burned her skin during filming. The set priest performed a quiet blessing, but even he admitted off-record that something had latched onto the production. Lorraine begged the studio not to use the real name, Valak, but they had already committed. "It adds authenticity," they said. "It's grounded in ancient lore." She knew better. Speaking the name, writing it, depicting it, these were forms of invocation. Then a series of unexplained mishaps plagued the production. Equipment failure, spontaneous fires, and at one point, an entire night's footage mysteriously erased from every drive. No explanation, no recovery. One actor, who portrayed a priest, suffered a nervous breakdown after filming a particularly intense scene involving a possession. He later claimed he had seen a figure watching from behind the lights, and that his dreams had turned dark and unrelenting. Hollywood thought they had created a marketable villain. Lorraine knew they had given her a face. In interviews, Lorraine remained vague, never directly confirming the nun's origin. But those who knew her could see the sorrow behind her eyes, the burden of knowing that fiction had now invited truth into millions of homes. The films were more than entertainment. They were vessels. By turning Valak into a character, the world had spoken her name collectively, and as the ancient texts warned, in darkness, unity is summoning. Ed grew increasingly anxious. He feared the mass exposure had fed the entity, gave her power, recognition. And in the world of the supernatural, belief is currency. The more people feared her, the stronger she became. The final straw came when a fan mailed Lorraine a replica of the nun's veil, handmade, blessed. At a convention and accompanied by a note that read, "I hope she visits me." Lorraine burned the veil immediately. The room was still, yet charged with an energy Lorraine hadn't felt in years. As she sat in prayer, fingers tightly wrapped around a rosary now blackened with age, a thought echoed through her mind, not her own, but placed there gently with a dreadful certainty. You were never meant to stop her, only to warn them. It struck her harder than any vision ever had. For decades, Ed and Lorraine had fought what others denied: ghosts, demons, malevolent spirits. But what if Valak wasn't meant to be contained? What if their entire encounter, their escape, their silence, had all been part of something else? Not a curse, a message. In her trances, Lorraine began to see visions not of fear, but of sequence, a pattern. Places where the veil between worlds had thinned: Amityville, Enfield, Harrisville, and now Hollywood. Each encounter had pushed her closer to something, a center not yet reached. She remembered what the Vatican letter had said. She is the gate. Valak wasn't just an entity. She was a conduit, yes, but more than that, a siren, a harbinger of what lay beyond. And her purpose wasn't just torment, it was awakening. To condition the world to accept fear, so when the real darkness came, it wouldn't be resisted. It would be welcomed. The disguise of the nun was not chosen at random. It was a symbol twisted, corrupted, a form that invoked both faith and vulnerability. Valak needed to be seen, to be feared. She needed the world to remember her, even if through fiction. Because fiction, Lorraine now realized, was the safest container for truth. But that container had cracked. With every film, every whisper of her name, every replication of her image, more energy flowed, more belief, more summoning. Ed, concerned by Lorraine's deteriorating health, recorded her final thoughts in a journal meant never to be published. In it she wrote, "If she is a warning, then the world must choose. We were never her enemies, we were her heralds." It was the most painful truth of all, that their lives, their battles, their scars, had served not just to fight evil, but to tell the world that something worse was coming. Not a nun, not a demon, but what comes when faith fails entirely. The monastery was silent. Years after the Warrens' original visit, a small team of paranormal researchers, none connected to Ed or Lorraine, returned to the Romanian site with modern equipment and skepticism. They were professionals, not believers, at least not at first. The tapes from that expedition, later leaked and promptly suppressed, showed footage of something more unnerving than any possession or haunting. The building itself had changed. It no longer resembled the photos in the archives. The structure was more decayed, more ancient, as if time itself had warped around it. The researchers reported the interior halls shifting, doors vanishing, corridors that led nowhere, or worse, into themselves. The lead investigator, Dr. Reiner, disappeared on the third night. His voice, however, was captured hours later on one of the team's audio logs. He was whispering, repeating a phrase. "It sees me. It sees through me." 2 members fled that same night. One suffered a psychotic break, describing dreams of being pulled into the earth by hands made of rosary beads. The other has refused to speak publicly, but privately admitted, "Something woke up under that place. Something used them, Warren and all, to prepare us. Prepare us." Back in Monroe, Lorraine was in her final days. She drifted in and out of lucidity, often calling Ed's name, though he had passed years earlier. Tony Spera, at her bedside, asked if she wanted to record anything. She simply said, "There's no need. They know now." That same week, a tremor struck the region near the monastery in Romania. Seismologists found no fault lines, no geological cause. Locals say it wasn't the ground that shook, but the air, the sky. And from that moment on, reports of a veiled woman seen across Europe surged, always silent, always watching. Tony closed the Warren Occult Museum shortly after Lorraine's death. The artifacts were placed under heavy guard, not just to protect the public, but to respect the gate that had been warned. To this day, the veil remains locked away, but every now and then it moves. And in the silence of that sealed room, a voice barely registers on the static of surveillance tapes, repeating in Latin, "Ego sum initium, I am the beginning." Could it be that the Demon Nun was never a villain, but a prophecy in disguise? What if all the horrors, the hauntings, the visions were a preparation for something far beyond our understanding? What do you believe? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your insight matters, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Because in our next video, we uncover the true story of a family whose child spoke to angels until the angels turned on them. Click now to continue your journey into the unknown.